The house was packed with the smells of roasted lamb and polished silver, hymns echoing from the parlor. Outside, the enslaved bent over fields that were still wet with morning frost, their bodies already bent in service, while the master's family dressed in fine linen for church. The day was supposed to mark resurrection. Instead, it became a funeral pyre. The plantation was a cage of contradictions. The bright white house, surrounded by rows of tobacco barns, stained with sweat and blood. The fragrance of Easter lilies, masking the stench of rotting meat. In the slave quarters, iron chains rattled in the yard like windchimes of torment. The earth around the cabins was packed hard by barefoot steps, soaked for decades with the blood of floggings and the afterbirth of women, whose babies were sold before they had names. Margaret, barely past her 20s, lived in that filth. She had seen her child ripped from her arms the previous year, sold for cash that bought her mistress a new carriage. Since then, she had moved through the days like ash, her voice flat, her back straight, her eyes empty. But in the weeks before Easter, something shifted. Her silence became sharper than a blade. She stared longer at the house's wooden beams, at the cracks where fire might catch. Her wound was not only her child's loss, it was a lifetime of accumulated scars. The overseer, who split her shoulder with his whip for not bowing fast enough, the master's hands that treated her body like property, the endless Sundays when she was forced to sing of Christ's mercy while standing in chains. On the night before Easter, as the quarters lay silent, she sat in the dirt with 3 others. They whispered over a broken candle. An elder traced signs in the dust, muttering of fire that purifies. A boy spoke of a dream where the big house turned red, and the bells rang not for church, but for death. By dawn, the plan was set. Margaret would carry coals hidden in her apron. Others would prepare water buckets near the cabins, pretending to serve but waiting for her signal. The old woman tied a strip of cloth around Margaret's wrist and called it a blessing. Margaret called it justice. When the family gathered in the dining hall for their Easter meal, Margaret slipped into the pantry. She placed the burning coals beneath stacked kindling left from the winter stores. Smoke crawled upward, thin at first, then swelling as the wood caught. By the time laughter rang from the table, the rafters were already breathing fire. The overseer noticed too late. Flames leapt across beams like unleashed spirits. Screams tore through him. The master tried to run, dragging his wife by the wrist, but the ceiling collapsed, showering embers and splintered wood. Margaret watched from the yard as the windows turned into squares of orange light. The smell of burning flesh spread across the field. For the enslaved, there were no shouts, no panic. They stood still, watching the fire consume what had consumed them. Margaret's face did not change. She held her apron tight, her eyes reflecting the inferno. The master's children shrieked until the sound ended in a crack of falling timber. The overseer stumbled out, hair and clothes aflame, clawing at his skin before collapsing into silence. That Easter, the whitewashed house became a blackened skeleton. Margaret did not flee. She stood before the ruins, smoke rising around her like incense, her body still as judgment. By nightfall, the story had spread through Virginia. A slave woman had burned her master alive on the holiest day of the year. Margaret's act was more than murder. To the planters it was a warning. To the enslaved, it was a psalm of the soil of Virginia had drunk another offering, and the air carried a truth too heavy to erase. Even the most broken could strike back, and even Easter could bleed. The ashes of Easter morning still smoldered when whispers began to crawl through the court. Smoke lingered in the trees for days, drifting across the plantation like a ghost that would not leave. The master's body, half burned and twisted, was pulled from the rubble by neighbors who arrived too late to save anyone. They covered his corpse with a sheet, but the stench of charred flesh and singed hair clung to the yard. His wife and children were never recovered whole. Only fragments, blackened bones, sifted from the collapsed beams. For the white planters nearby, fear settled heavier than grief. They gathered in their churches and parlors, voices hushed, hands trembling around cups of brandy. If one enslaved woman could erase a dynasty in a single morning, then none of their houses were safe. They spoke of insanity, of evil spirits, of a woman possessed. But behind those words was terror, the terror that every plantation held dozens of Margarets, waiting in silence, watching for their moment to burn. The enslaved, however, spoke differently. They did not call Margaret mad, they called her blessed by fire. In the quarters they whispered of her courage as if it were scripture. Children pointed at the smoke rising from the ruins, and said it was her spirit rising, proof that God had finally heard their cry. Women rocked their infants and prayed that the same fire would one day touch every master's house. Old men, scarred from decades of lashes, muttered that Margaret had done what they had only dreamed. Margaret herself did not boast. In the weeks after the blaze, she moved like a shadow, her face blank, her body marked by the smoke she had walked through. Her hands, once cracked and swollen from endless labor, carried no tools now, only silence. When questioned by the county men who came with rifles, she said nothing, not a word. Silence was her weapon, sharper than steel. They chained her, but she did not bow her head. At night, in the quarters, the whispers turned to plotting. A fire was not enough. Some wanted blood spilled by hand. Others spoke of poison, of blades hidden in flour sacks, of ropes that could strangle a master in his bed. In the far corner of the barracks, an elder woman named Ruth drew signs in the dirt, muttering in a tongue older than Virginia. She said she saw visions, the earth shaking, the cane fields burning, red sky over white houses. A young man named Isaac, who had lost his wife to the auction block, stood and declared that Margaret's act was not just vengeance, but a beginning. He argued that the fire was a signal, a trumpet announcing that the time for patience had ended. His words struck something deep. Men and women leaned in closer, eyes shining in the dark. They had all lost sons, daughters, mothers, lovers. Each scar had a name. Each silence had a grave. The conspiracy began in those hushed gatherings. Knives were sharpened from scrap iron, their edges rough but deadly. A boy who worked in the kitchen smuggled herbs known to stop the heart, tools meant for farming. Axes, hoes, heavy mallets were chosen and hidden near the cabins. Each night they rehearsed in whispers. Who would strike the overseer? Who would set fire to the stables? Who would carry the children through the swamps once the killing began? There was a rhythm to their plotting, a ritual. They spoke only after the moon rose. They met by the graveyard where broken stones marked unremembered names. They listened to the wind in the trees, certain it carried the voices of the dead, urging them on. Ruth declared that the ancestors demanded justice, and that the fire Margaret had lit was not finished. It was only the first spark. But fear also stalked them. Soldiers were rumored to be coming. Patrols rode through at night, their dogs sniffing the ruins, their muskets glinting in the moonlight. Any sign of rebellion meant the whip, the gallows, or worse. In the quarters, children were hushed to silence, and even laughter felt dangerous. The enslaved knew that one careless word could mean the death of all. Margaret sat apart from the rest, her eyes hollow, her wrists still wrapped in the strip of cloth Ruth had tied before the fire. She said little, but her presence was enough. Every time her gaze lifted, men who once bent their backs straightened. Every time she touched a stone or piece of wood, it seemed to gain weight, to hold the promise of retribution. She had become more than a woman. She was a sign, living proof, that the masters could be made mortal. One night, as thunder rolled faint in the distance, Isaac declared that the storm itself was a signal. He raised a rusted axe and said, "When the sky gives its third thunder, we strike, not before." The word spread like a commandment. 3 thunders. Children whispered it in their sleep. Mothers taught it to their babies as a lullaby. Men repeated it while sharpening their blades. And in the silence between the cracks of thunder, Margaret finally spoke. Her voice was low, ragged, but every ear caught it. "They took my child," she said. "I took their house. Now we take everything." The room was still. Outside, the storm gathered. The second thunder rolled like a drumbeat across the fields. They waited, hearts pounding, knowing the third would come, and when it did, Virginia would burn again. The third thunder broke across the Virginia sky like the tearing of the world itself. It rattled the wooden walls of the quarters, rolled across the fields, and echoed off the blackened skeleton of the master's house. Every man, woman, and child who had whispered the words knew it was the signal. Silence followed, the kind of silence that lives just before blood is spilled. Isaac moved first. The axe he had hidden beneath straw was already in his hands. His eyes burned, but his steps were calm. "The overseer dies first," he said. There was no debate, no hesitation. The overseer was the one who had dragged children by the neck into the fields, who carried a whip that had peeled skin from bone, who had laughed when women begged for their sons. His death was not a choice, it was a sentence. They waited until midnight, when the patrols had passed, and only the frogs and crickets sang in the swamps. The overseer's shack stood near the edge of the quarters, built sturdier than any cabin, its walls fat with arrogance. He slept with a pistol under his pillow, drunk on rum, trusting fear to guard him. But fear had shifted sides. Isaac pushed the door with his shoulder. The hinges creaked, but no alarm rose. In the dark the overseer stirred. His eyes blinked open, and for a heartbeat he saw only shadow. Then he saw Margaret. She stood in the doorway, her face lit by the thin glow of a lantern. He sat up, reaching for the pistol, but Isaac's axe fell first. The sound was not a crack, not a scream, but a wet thud that shook the floorboard. The overseer's body jerked, his hands scrabbling at the sheets, his mouth opening in a gurgle. Isaac struck again, and again. The bed shook with the force, blood spattering the walls, soaking the boards. When it was done, the overseer's head lolled half-severed, his eyes wide and shut. No one spoke. They only listened to his blood dripping on the floor. It was a sound they had all waited to hear. The next target was a patrol rider. For years he had been the terror of the night, riding with dogs, dragging back those who tried to flee, leaving their corpses nailed to trees as warnings. That night, he sat by a fire near the stables, his boots off, his rifle leaning against the barrel. He never saw the boy coming. Ben, no older than 12, slipped behind him with a rope. His hands shook, but he pulled tight around the man's throat. The rider thrashed, clawing at the noose, kicking over the fire so that sparks flew into the hay. His face darkened, his eyes bulged, his heels drummed against the dirt. The boy held on, teeth clenched, until the body sagged and stilled. The dogs whined, pulling at their chains, but no one moved to silence them. They let the beasts howl at the corpse of their master. By dawn, 3 more white men were dead. One was a trader, passing through, known for chaining children and selling them in lots. He was found with his mouth stuffed full of earth and his chest caved in by a mallet. Another was a drunken cousin who had whipped a woman for dropping a tray. He died screaming as boiling water from the kitchen pot was poured across his face, his skin blistering, sloughing off in sheets. The third was a clerk who kept the plantation's ledgers. He was hanged from the rafters of the ruined house, his ledger nailed to his chest, every page stained with his blood. Each death was not random. It was chosen, measured, deliberate. The enslaved did not strike like animals in frenzy. They struck like judges, delivering verdicts. Each act mirrored the crimes of the dead: whips, fire, chains, boiling, hanging, retribution in the exact tongue of cruelty. As the killing spread, Margaret stood at the center of it all. She did not swing the axe or hold the rope, but her eyes followed each act. When Isaac raised his bloodied blade, he looked to her, and she nodded once. When the boy Ben loosed his rope from the patrolman's neck, he looked to her, and she placed her hand on his head. When the women scolded the cousin with boiling water, they looked to her, and she did not turn away. To them she was not just a conspirator, she was the fire itself, walking among them in human form. By the second week, the plantation was unrecognizable. The white families, who had once strolled the lanes in silks and boots, now lay in shallow graves, their names whispered, only in curses. The cabins were alive with a strange energy, a mixture of fear and exultation. Some wept for what was coming: the soldiers, the gallows, the inevitable retribution. But many more felt something they had never known: power. For the first time, they walked without bowing their heads. The air itself seemed to change. The fields that had once reeked of sweat now carried the sharper smell of smoke and blood. Chains lay rusting in piles, broken and discarded. At night the quarters filled not with silence, but with low songs, old words rising again, songs that had been buried beneath centuries of whip. Still, they knew it could not last. Riders from the county had already seen the smoke. Rumors of Margaret's fire had spread into towns and taverns. Fear was breeding faster than the flames. Armies would come, guns would come. The question was not if, but when. Margaret knew this too. She sat alone, in the ruins of the master's house, staring into the blackened hearth. The walls still stank of charred flesh. She touched the soot with her fingers, then rubbed it across her forehead like ash at a funeral. "This house is dead," she said to no one, "and so must their world be." Her words carried back to the quarters, and with them, a new vow was born. They would not just kill, they would erase. Fields, houses, barns, the land itself would burn, so that nothing remained of the old order, but ashes and memory. The fire had begun with Margaret. Now it would consume Virginia. The night of the burning began without wind. The air lay heavy, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. For days the conspirators had prepared, gathering scraps of pitch, oil and dry husks hidden beneath baskets of grain. Children carried bundles of kindling in their aprons. Old men stripped bark from pine trees, resinous and quick to flame. The plan was simple. If soldiers were to come, they would not find a plantation to reclaim. They would find only ash. Margaret walked the rows of tobacco fields, one last time, barefoot in the soil that had soaked her blood for years. The earth smelled of iron and mold, of sweat that had never been her own, but always stolen. She bent down, pressed her palm to the ground, and whispered, "Now you breathe." Then she rose and gave the signal. They began with the cane shed, stacked high with dry stalks. Isaac struck the first torch, its fire leaping as if eager for its work. He tossed it into the heap, and within moments, the shed was a roaring pyre, flames climbing the night like a ladder into heaven. The enslaved watched without fear, their eyes wide, their faces lit red. For years they had bent their backs beneath these. Now they watched them crumble to embers. Next were the barns. Women carried pots of oil, flinging them against the wooden walls. Boys ran with torches, lighting the corners. The roofs caught fast, beams snapping in the heat, sparks raining down onto the earth. Horses screamed inside, but no one moved to open the gates. Those beasts had dragged too many bodies, carried too many whips. Their cries became part of the chorus of destruction. Then came the fields themselves. Fire swept across the rows, devouring crops, planted with stolen hands. Smoke rose thick, a black veil over the stars. The air reeked of sap, boiling, of scorched leaves, of history burning. Margaret stood at the edge of the inferno, the heat rippling across her face. She did not flinch. She had fed these fields with her youth, her child, her tears. Now she fed them fire. The final act was the house. Though charred from the Easter blaze, parts of the mansion still stood, scorched walls, half-burned beams, fragments of marble floors that once echoed with laughter and commands. To the whites, it had been a sanctuary. To the enslaved, it had been a dungeon. They piled wood at its base, soaked it in oil, and lit it from all sides. As the flames rose, they gathered in the yard, forming a circle. Ruth, the elder, raised her hands and began to chant in a tongue older than Virginia, words carried across oceans and chains. Others joined, voices weaving into one. They sang not hymns of meekness, but songs of release, of ancestors rising from the soil, of spirits walking through the fire unbound. Margaret stepped into the circle. She carried a strip of cloth, the same one tied around her wrist before the Easter fire. She held it to the flames until it caught, then lifted it high. "This is their end," she said, "and our beginning." She dropped the burning cloth onto the ground, and the circle erupted in shouts. Some screamed names of children stolen. Others shouted curses against the dead masters. The fire answered them all, roaring louder, filling the night with heat and thunder. The house collapsed before dawn. Its roof caved inward, with a crash that shook the yard, sending sparks into the sky like a storm of stars. The marble floor cracked under the weight of falling beams. What had once been the master's parlor became a pit of glowing embers. For a brief moment, the enslaved stood free in the glow of their own destruction. No overseer's whip, no master's command, no chains but the ones they had chosen to break. Some laughed, wild and breathless. Others wept, clutching each other, unable to believe they were still alive to see it. The children danced barefoot in the ash, their faces streaked with soot, their eyes bright with something new, something that looked like freedom. But freedom, they knew, was temporary. Already they could see the distant glow of lanterns in the woods, patrols searching, soldiers gathering. The fire would draw them like moth. By morning the hunt would begin. Margaret turned to the others. "We don't run," she said. "Not tonight. Tonight we burn. Let them come to ashes." Her words carried over the crackling fields. Some nodded, ready to die where they stood. Others whispered of the swamps, of hiding places where soldiers could not follow. But for that night, none moved. They stayed together, bound not by chains but by choice. The plantation was gone, its wealth, its power, its cruelty, reduced to smoke, drifting into the sky. The land itself seemed to sigh, relieved of its burden. For the first time in generations, no whip cracked, no command barked, no bell summoned them to labor. There was only the fire, the night, and the silence of a world undone. When dawn finally broke, the sky was red, as if the fire had stained it. The fields smoldered, the house lay in ruins, and the air was thick with ash. Margaret stood at the center, her skin blackened with soot, her eyes hollow but unbroken. To the enslaved around her, she was no longer just a woman. She was the flame that had devoured their chains. And in the distance, the sound of drums and hoofbeats came closer. Retribution was on its way. The soldiers came at dawn, hooves first, heavy, rhythmic, rattling the earth like drums of judgment. Then the dogs, snarling, choking against their leashes, their noses wild with the smell of blood and ash. Finally, the men in gray and blue, militia patrol, bounty hunters, faces set, rifles ready. They had not come to ask questions, they had come to make examples. From the ridge above the ruins, they saw the smoke still rising, curling into the red sky. What had once been the estate was now a skeleton, black fields, collapsed barns, the mansion reduced to glowing embers. To them it was a nightmare come alive. Slaves not just running, not just hiding, but destroying, erasing. They muttered words like demon, insurrection, witchcraft. Fear made their hands twitch on their muskets. Margaret and the others saw them too. She stood in the yard, her body streaked with soot, her hair matted with ash. Around her the rebels tightened their grip on axes, knives, iron rods, torn from the ruins. Children clung to mother, old men held stones. No one fled, not yet. Isaac raised his axe. "We hold," but Margaret shook her head. "We scatter. The swamp takes us where no soldier will follow. Live now, strike again later." Her voice was calm, final. Arguments flared. Some wanted to stand and die, to make their last breath a weapon. Others wanted to run, to cling to the chance of tomorrow. The choice tore them in two, but the soldiers made the decision for them. The first volley cracked through the air. Smoke burst from rifle. A boy screamed, clutching his chest, blood soaking through his shirt. The dogs lunged, dragging men to the ground, their teeth ripping flesh. Chaos broke like a storm. Isaac swung his axe into the first soldier who charged, splitting his skull with a wet crunch. Another musket fired, and Isaac fell, his chest torn open. Women hurled torches into the dry brush, sending walls of fire between them and their hunters. Mothers dragged children into the trees, the air filled with smoke, gunpowder, and screams. Margaret did not run. She stood in the center of the yard as the soldiers closed in, firelight dancing on their bayonets. Her eyes were steady, her hands empty. The captain raised his pistol. "You," he spat. "You started this." She did not answer. She only lifted her chin, her silence heavier than any words. They bound her in chains, her wrists raw, her ankles bleeding where the iron cut. They dragged her past the corpses of her comrades, past the fields still smoldering, past the ruins of the house she had burned. She did not resist. To the soldiers, it looked like surrender. To the enslaved watching from the shadows of the swamp, it looked like defiance. The hunt tore through the woods for days. Dogs chased fugitives through the cypress. Soldiers fired blindly into the mist. Some rebels were caught and shot on sight. Others were whipped until their backs split open and then hanged from the nearest tree. Their bodies swung above the roads as warnings, their faces left to rot in the sun. But some escaped. Ben, the boy who had strangled the patrolman, slipped into the swamp and was never seen again. Ruth, the elder, vanished into the woods with 2 children, her chants echoing faintly at night, like prayers drifting through the trees. Others melted into nearby plantations, blending back into the faceless mass of bondage, their silence hiding their fire. Margaret was not given that escape. She was hauled to the county jail, a squat brick building that smelled of mold and sweat. They locked her in irons, paraded her before crowds who cursed and spat. Preachers called her Satan's bride, planters called her a contagion. But when they looked into her eyes, many lowered their gaze. There was no fear in them, only certainty. The trial was quick, little more than ritual. Witnesses swore they had seen her light the flames. Survivors of the patrol spoke of her silence as proof of guilt. The judge, red-faced, declared her crime not just murder, but treason against God and the natural order. Her sentence, death by hanging, public, to remind every slave what rebellion cost. They brought her to the gallows on a Sunday morning, the church bells ringing in mockery of Easter past. The crowd gathered, whispering, pointing, some with hatred, some with fear. The rope hung thick and coarse, the wood of the scaffold creaking under her weight. The preacher asked her for last words. She said nothing, but when the noose was placed around her neck, she looked at the crowd, at the slaves herded there to watch, at the masters clutching their canes, at the soldiers with muskets ready. And then she spoke, just 3 words, sharp as knives. Fire remembers everything. The trapdoor fell. Her body jerked, twisted, stilled. But in the quarters, in the swamps, in the fields of Virginia, her words spread faster than fire itself. Mothers whispered them to children. Men carved them into wood. Songs rose in the night, low and steady, carrying her name. Margaret was dead, but Margaret was everywhere. The soldiers thought they had ended the rebellion. They had only fed it. They hanged Margaret to kill her body, but they could not kill what she had become. In the weeks after her execution, the gallows stood empty, its wood stained, dark, where her feet had swung. But the air around it never seemed clean again. Some swore they could smell smoke each time they passed. Others whispered that at night, when the wind shifted, the creak of the scaffold chains sounded like her breathing. The masters tried to erase her. They forbade her name in the court. They burned scraps of testimony, banned gatherings, doubled patrols. But the more they tried to bury her, the deeper her memory rooted. Among the enslaved, Margaret's fire turned into scripture. Mothers rocking infants sang low of the woman who burned the Easter house. Children whispered her 3 last words, "Fire remembers everything," as a secret prayer before sleep. Old men who had seen too many lashes said she had done what they had dreamed, but never dared. For them, Margaret was proof that the world could be torn open, that masters could bleed, that chains were not eternal. The swamps carried her legend farther. Refugees who had fled during the uprising whispered to maroons, those hidden communities of escaped slaves, that a woman had burned her master alive and stood silent before soldiers. They carried her name downriver, across counties, even into the Carolinas. Her fire traveled faster than the law. Meanwhile, the planters lived in paranoia. Every crack of thunder made them look toward the barns. Every candle flame felt like a threat. Some slept with rifles at their bedsides. Others moved their families into town, abandoning the plantations after dusk. They preached harder at Sunday services, urging obedience, warning of hellfire. Yet behind their sermons was fear, not of God's wrath, but of Margaret's memory. Even white children felt it. On Easter mornings, when bells rang and families gathered for church, they glanced at the fields with unease. Some said they dreamed of fire chasing them through their own houses. Parents hushed them, but the fear lingered. Margaret's rebellion had poisoned even the day of resurrection. The enslaved took strength from that fear. They saw the tremor in their master's hands, the sleeplessness in their eyes, and they knew the balance had shifted. Even in chains, they had struck terror into the ones who claimed to own them. Margaret's silence had spoken louder than any sermon. In time, songs rose. At night in the quarters, voices carried softly through the dark. The house that burned on Easter, the woman who did not bow. Her fire lives in the earth, and the earth remembers now. The soldiers who patrolled plantations sometimes caught fragments of these songs. They dismissed them as nonsense, but some felt chills all the same. Margaret's name became a warning too. Mothers told daughters, "Do not bow too deep. Remember, Margaret." Overseers, when beating men, spat curses. "You'll hang like that witch, Margaret." Yet every insult only kept her alive. A decade later, when new uprisings flared in the South, soldiers still muttered of Easter fire. In prisons, rebels scratched her name into stone walls. In swamps, Maroons told children's stories of how Margaret lit a torch and made the earth itself burn. Even death could not cage her, and the land remembered. The ruins of the estate, never rebuilt, grass grew through the blackened stones. Wildflowers sprouted where the parlor once stood. Locals avoided the place, claiming the soil was cursed, that animals refused to graze there. But the enslaved who passed would pause, touch the ground and whisper her name. For them, Margaret was no ghost. She was a promise, a sign that the fire did not end with her body, but burned still in every hand that longed for freedom. The masters had hanged a woman. The people had gained a legend. And each Easter, when the bells rang, the fields of Virginia seemed to whisper back, "Fire remembers everything."